So for 10a, we're going to determine the period and the amplitude of each function of the graph. Remember, the amplitude is how tall the graph is, and it also relates to your a value. And the period is talking about how long each cycle is. And the period of a sine or a cosine graph is 2 pi over b. So the period is 2 pi over b. So that's all just from chapter 5. So let's look first of all at the green graph here. Is the green, what would be the amplitude of the green graph? Again, how tall is it from the middle?
Green.
Whoa, blue. How tall is the blue graph? 2, right. So if you look from here, it is 2 units tall, so the amplitude is 2. Let's look at the period of the blue graph. So the period is when it completes one full cycle. So I see that this blue graph is starting right there at 0, and then the time it takes to go up, down, and come back to its starting point is at 4 pi. So here the period is at 4 pi for the blue graph. Now let's look at the red graph. What is the amplitude here of the red graph? Yep, 1/2. And the period, again, I'm going to look at where it completes one full cycle. So it starts here, it goes down, back up to its starting point right there. So the period for the red graph would be at pi. Yes. Now we're going to make our equation. So now when we come up with the equation of the blue graph, we're going to use a sine equation because it starts at 0, 0. A should be easy. A is just your amplitude. So if A is 2, that means I'm going to put a 2 in here for sine. The B is what's more complicated. Now what's the normal period of a sine graph? 2 pi, right. But this one isn't at 2 pi. It's been stretched to 4 pi. So what did I... Right, so I divided by 1 over 2 to stretch it 2 times bigger. So that means B would be 1 over 2x. Now I want to show you, if in case you're ever not sure how to logically figure that out, there is a way using our little formula right here. So if we know that 2 pi over b is the period, and here I'm saying the period is 4 pi, you can basically make it into a little equation and cross multiply. So again, this is the period, 4 pi over 1, and the period formula is 2 pi over b. So if I cross multiply, I get 2 pi equals 4 pi b, and then when I divide out the 4 pi, we get that b equals, the pi's would cancel, and 2 over 4 is half. So again, just plugging it into our formula where period equals 2 pi over b, and cross multiplying can tell you your b value algebraically instead of logically. Alright, so let's look at our red graph now. The red graph we're going to say is a cosine graph because it starts up at 1. The amplitude we already said is half. So that means I'm going to put half in for A. Now the period is pi. So remember that normally the period would be 2 pi, but this period is only pi. So what did I divide by to get the 2 pi to pi? 2. Right. So B would be a 2. And that would be making up the equations. So let's take a look at this word problem. It says we have a Ferris wheel with a radius of 14 meters. Now this represents a circular function because a Ferris wheel is round and it travels in circles. So that's why this would represent a sine or a cosine graph. It's got a radius of 14 meters. It rotates once every 32 seconds. Passengers get on at the bottom of the wheel that is 2 meters above the ground level. Suppose the ride begins just after you get on the wheel. We're going to sketch a graph showing your height above the ground during the first 1 1/4 revolutions of the wheel. So we started by drawing our graph. The Ferris wheel starts at 2, it would go up to 30, because again it's a radius of 14 and then another 14, and then back down, and that takes 32 seconds. So now we're going to come up with the equation. First of all, I should notice that my cos graph is negative, because it starts down at the bottom instead of starting up at the top. So I'm going to start with a negative a value. The amplitude is going to be how high it is from the bottom to the middle, or from the top to the middle. So what's my amplitude?
16.
14. It's 14, right? Because the radius of the Ferris wheel would represent how high from the middle to the top or the middle to the bottom. So next we have to come up with the b value. I know that the period of a cosine graph is 2 pi over b. And this time I know the period. The period is 32 seconds because that's when it will complete one revolution. So I'm going to use my little formula and I'm going to trade out 32 for the period. Now you can think of this as 32 over 1, and we can cross multiply. So when I cross multiply, I get 2 pi equals 32b. Divide out the 32, and then we end up with, if I look at the 2 pi divided by 32, I can reduce this by 2. So we end up with pi over 16 for b. So I'd put pi over 16 in for b. Now these real life questions will have a weird b value. It usually isn't just like a nice 2 or a half or something. So again, use your little formula, cross multiply to get your b. Alright, so there's no h value, but there is a k value. Now the k value is at 16, because remember that the k value would represent where the middle of the graph moved to. So if the middle of the graph was at 0, and now the middle of the graph is at 16, the midline moved up to 16. So again, the k value is represented where the middle of the graph goes, because the middle was at 0, but now the middle is at 16. So now that I have my equation, we can answer question C. Question C says, at what time will the Ferris wheel be 8 meters above the ground? Okay, so 8 meters above the ground is talking about a y value. So I'm going to plug in, and I'm just going to kind of separate this here. I'm going to plug in 8 for y. So we get minus 14 cos pi over 16x plus 16. Now this is the equation part of this stuff. This is where we have to solve, and we have to solve to get x. Now remember, when we're solving to get x, we want the cos part to be alone. So that's what I'm trying to get by itself. What should I move first? The 16. I'm going to subtract the 16 over first. So I get a minus 8 equals minus 14 cos pi over 16x. So again, I'm still trying to get that cos by itself. So now what can I move? Divide it by the minus 14. Minus 14. So negative 8 divided by negative 14 is 0.57. And that's going to equal cos of pi over 16x. Now this part, we have pi over 16x. What is that? What does pi over 16x represent? An angle. It's an angle. Yes. So how do I now get the angle by itself and move the cosine? Inverse. Exactly. Now I need my answer, or my calculator here in radians, because this is in radians. So I'm going to inverse cos of 0.57, and that's going to equal pi over 16x. When I inverse cos of 0.57 on your calculator, I get 0.96, and again that equals pi over 16x. Now, almost done. How do you get the 16 off the bottom? Multiply it, right? So we're going to multiply by the 16. And then how do I move the pi after? Divide it, right? So I'm going to take 0.96, I'm going to multiply out the 16, and then divide out the pi. And when we do that, we get 4.9 seconds equals x, which means that 4.9 seconds into the ride, the Ferris wheel will be 8 meters high. Now part D here is going to be different. Part D is saying, how high will they be after 16 seconds? So the 16 here represents x. I'm finding y. So we're going to get y equals minus 14 cos pi over 16x, but this time x is 16, and then plus 16.
Could you just...
So what we should notice here is that your 16 dividing and your 16 multiplying will cancel, which will just leave you with minus 14 cos of pi plus 16. Now you guys, what is cos at pi? Look on your circle. What is cos at pi?
180.
What is
1?
Cos at pi?
Negative 1.
Yep, negative 1. So that means that cos at pi, and you guys, you can type that into your calculator. You can type in cos pi, and you'll get negative 1. So this means minus 14 times minus 1 is going to be a positive 14, plus 16 equals 30. So 16 seconds into the ride, you're at 30. Where's 30 on the graph? Or in the situation? 30 meters. But what part of the Ferris wheel ride is that? The top, right. This is at the top, and if you look at your graph, It should make sense that that's the top, because at 16 seconds, we said we are at the top, right? That was halfway through your cycle.